Okay.
So before I get started, I'd like to just take 1 minute to look backwards. So we worked on a prior SAMP for a long time. We also spent a bunch of money, about $10 million over 3.5 years. And the result of that has just come to fruition 2 weeks ago, which is the first offshore wind farm in the United States. And I would tell you that the reason it was first is not because the turbines weren't available, or the towers weren't available, or the construction stuff wasn't available. It was detailed, careful, and thoughtful planning carried out in a clear, straightforward, transparent way that allowed us to sort of be first in the nation. And I had an opportunity to go out and take a look at them. And if you have not seen them, I would encourage you to do so. It's unless you have hung out at the Gulf of Mexico and the offshore rigs, you've never seen any offshore construction to challenge this. These are extraordinary structures. The turbines, by the way, just another little aside, GE bought the turbine manufacturer, and the numbers, so we got 6 turbines, and we got, of the 6, they came from the first 8 in the production line. So these are world-class turbines anywhere in terms of their size. All right, with that I stop. So I'm going to talk to you about the Coastal Environmental Risk Index. So I was sort of the one that came up with this idea for storm tools, and I got asked a question, which is, yeah, okay, I got all these wonderful flooding maps. How can I help the coastal community in better understanding the details of the risk that they face and how it is that they might respond? And so I came up with this conceptual idea for this Coastal Environmental Risk Index. So as I tell my students, you can read those things yourself. So there's the challenge. Figure out to come up with some risk index. And for me, the idea that the risk is high or low or medium is leaves me a little cold because it's in the mind of the interpreter. So what I'm looking for is a quantitative risk assessment method where I can actually give you some numbers and the basis of that risk assessment. As I tell my students, the first part of every job is to have an absolutely crystal clear statement of what it is you're about. And if you don't know what it is you're about, it's impossible to execute. And so this is a statement of the objective or the goal of the activity, which is to develop this index and to use that to be able to assess the risk for structures and infrastructure. And I'm interested in flooding, sea level rise, the waves are associated with that, and the shoreline erosion and accretion that may occur. To make this thing quantitative, rather than say the risk is high to that building or low, what I've done is I've used damage as a metric or a measure of risk. So if your structure gets taken out its entirety, the risk is pretty high. And if you get your feet wet, the risk is not so high. And if it's at your waist, that's sort of in the 40% category, right? So those are the kinds of numbers that I'm after. So here's the conceptual flow chart about how the system works. So the far left is essentially water level and waves. We use the 100 years, this 100-year return period with sea level rise. The reason we do that is it turns out that all of our building standards and our flood maps and our firms, our federal rate insurance maps, they're all linked into this 100-year return, right? It's also the design return periods for storms. And so that's why we have this 100-year. The center part is structures and infrastructure. We've got to have both the type, the location, and some of the details about that. And then far off to the other side, is essentially damage functions, which is if the water level goes up to this level on this building, this is how much damage that incurs, right? So, and it makes a difference, by the way, whether it's just water, so inland flooding is a classic case of inundation, versus coastal flooding, which is you have inundation and then you have waves sitting on top of that. And of course, the waves sitting on top of the inundation dramatically increases the damage. And then the output of it is some visualization, so that's in the lower left. And then if you really love the numbers, if you're very excited about the numbers, it's the probability distribution of what the damages look like and the cumulative probability distribution. So we can talk to you in terms of the pictures or in terms of the actual numbers. So I just told you about the building blocks here. So the first thing we've got to do is start off, and we've got to decide how it is we're going to classify the structures. So it turns out that when the Corps of Engineers goes in to, and when FEMA went in to do an assessment of the damage associated with Sandy, what they did is they classified the structures, looked at the damages, and then came up with a metric. That structure was, the water level was here, this is how much damage it saw. And so the methodology here and the prototyping, or the definition of the prototypes, is by structure. And so what I've done is I've picked out the prototype curve, which is, or table is to the left, tells you all of them. And the ones to the right are the ones that are most common in our part of the world, 5, 6, and 7, and then A's and B's. Okay, so roughly it's single or multi-story houses without a basement, with a basement, and then some elevated structures. All right? So that it turns out that that's most of the housing stock that we have in most of the area. And so those categorizations are important because the damage functions that we have are in alignment with those. If you like plots and you like to look at damages, we calculate both the structural damage and the content damage. So the damage to your place because it impacted the structure, or the other one is there's a bunch of content, right? So if you have a basement and you have those cellar windows and you get flooding, the flooding doesn't have to come to the first floor, it simply runs into cellar windows. And then what happened is all of the infrastructure that you have in the basement has been floating and whacking away at the floor, right? So you've lost a whole lot of infrastructure, content, and then structure eventually as a result of that. So these are some pictures of the damages, and the upper ones are for water, all right, so straight inundation, and the second one is for waves, which also causes some severe damage as well. This is also to sort of separate this out a little bit. The damage functions are given, and it's the water level relative to the first finished floor elevation. Okay, so you could understand if your house is elevated and the flooding doesn't come up to the first finished floor elevation, you think, I'm good, right? You can see, if you looked at the center one, the number there is negative. So you start getting damage before you get to the first finished floor elevation, and the reason is that water's running in the basement. So you can come up with 20% damage by having a water elevation that just touches the first finished floor. All right, that compares to a classic house with no basement, which is the first finished floor is about 2 feet above grade. And for most elevated structures, pile-supported structures, an example is the one on the right, those typically are elevated 9 or 10 feet. Some are higher, but most of them here are about that. So here's this is a typical picture of what the damage might look like. And what's interesting about it is if you look at that picture, the question is, do you think that that's real or not? How many would vote for it being real? Raise your hand. How many think that's an artifact of some PhD student doing visualization? Okay, the second group's got it right. This is just to go to show you what level we're at in terms of the visualization. And we're going to give you some example of that. What I particularly like is the visualization of the debris field. The building's not so hard. Getting the debris field to look like that takes a lot of work to do that. But okay. So the two areas that we looked at in this pilot project, this was funded by some funds from the state. Bless their hearts for doing this. We picked out Warwick as an example inside the bay and Charlestown as an example outside. So different exposure. So the one in Charlestown, obviously a lot of wave exposure, water level lower. In Warwick, higher water levels and lower wave exposure. So different kinds of environments. So you've already seen the sea level rise curve. So the numbers we work with are 1, 2, and 7. These are planning horizons. So you've seen the values. Nicole just showed them previously to you. These are, we actually, when we started this project, we were doing the original projections, and it was going to be 5 feet in 2100, and we were 2 months in, and they changed it to 7 feet. That's the high value. You might guess that it might change again, but what we're doing right this minute is planning for the 7. So here's a little flavor, right? So this is what the Charleston area looks like, and this has got 4 levels of sea level rise. So this is mean high water based, so it's essentially the average of the highest high tides every day for an entire, long period of time. And so this tells you sort of what gets wet. And what you can see is at 1 foot, we get a little bit around the margins. And then as we go up to 4 or 5 feet, we start to wet some more. But we don't see some sort of dramatic increase in area wetted, right? And the reason is we've got relatively serious topographic relief here, relatively speaking, compared to, say, Florida. If we did the Florida case, the center of Florida is at 5 feet above sea level, and Miami is under, as far as I understand it right now. But here, we have some topographic relief. And anyone who looks at that picture would also can see Route 1 and knows that if you go to the north of Route 1, it's a much different environment than immediately to the south. But okay. Here's a picture of the 100-year flood event for this area. So you can see what happened is we essentially have the coastal pond, Ninigrit Pond, and the area all the way around the border, but nothing goes north of Route 1. Between sea level rise, so sea level rise, okay, we got a little bit of additional area, but we put the 100-year storm on, and we're going to create an offshore island out there and run a ferry service, Warwick Neck, right? Anyway, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you some results of some very, very high resolution, the highest resolution simulations of any place in the country for our area, and looking at Charleston area to begin with, and then I'm going to switch over to do Warwick, okay? Now, this picture shows you the combination of, for a 100-year storm, including the waves, and so the box here, the color coding is in meters, so 5 meters is about 16 feet, just so you have some reference there. And what you can see, the coastal ponds we've taken out because we're not so interested in what goes on in the middle of the pond, we're interested in what happens on land. And you can see the color gradation from red to blue essentially is the decrease in the wave amplitude as the wave propagates up on the coast, right? Now, one of the things I've done is I put this red circle here, this red oval. And I would remind you that for Charlestown, and that's the entire town of Charlestown, a good part of it is this barrier system, right? And so the barrier system there, essentially, if you looked at this picture, you don't see sort of really, really large waves in the pond, and the reason is that the dunes are protecting the area, right? So I tell you, here's we've essentially have our coastal geologists take a look at this, and the picture in the lower left shows you what happened after 1954 hurricane, right? So this is after Carol. So Carol's order a 100-year event, and what you find post the storm, which is the dunes are gone, and you have all of these surge channels that are cut into the barrier. And so the top of the dune gets mowed off, right? So the dune fails to provide any protection, and then what happened is those waves that were breaking before on the dunes now are essentially can go right straight into the ponds, all right? And so what we did is the insert picture shows you, the yellow there shows you what the thing looks like, and the orange-brown shows you what it is that they project the shoreline would look like with dune failure, all right? So here, take a look. This is the difference here. I don't know if you can remember what the other one looked like, but just to help you remind you, you can see what happened here is you compare the other one, which is the barrier didn't have any breaking, so the dunes kept all of those waves offshore and the water came in the inlet. Look what happens here. The dunes essentially have disappeared. They serve a very useful function in that the waves break over the top of the dunes, right? But what happened is those waves can continue on shore, and so you get much larger breaking waves very close to shore. All right, so it moved that thing considerably inland. Here's what happened if you with the sea level rise. Now you take a look at that and you say, what happened to those dunes? Well, what happened is that's underwater. The dunes fail, it's underwater, and so what happened is the waves then can go straight up against the coast, and you can see the offset, right? So you essentially have the wave attack much further inland. All right, so that's sort of the environment we're working in. We sort of understand what the water level looks like. We understand what the waves are doing over that area. The next thing to do is to sort of take a look at what's going to happen with structures at risk. So we took a look and we ended up using the E911 database. And the benefit of doing that is that it's all of these structures are located. The other thing I tell you about it is that the E911 database is constantly updated. So it's unlike many other databases, which is somebody did it, they finished it at a given time and they walked away from it. E911 is always updated because every time somebody changes a building or a structure, creates a new building, it's added to the database. So that information is available. For us, it turns out that it's got all of the characteristics of the buildings, or most of the characteristics of the buildings, that we need to populate our model. So this is a picture for Charlestown. These are the structures that are there by category. So 5 are essentially single story, no basement. 6B is multiple story with a basement. And then 7s are essentially elevated structures. And each of those dots represents a building. And you can see that in this area we have 1322. This is in the 100-year plus 7 feet of sea level rise footprint. And a third of the structures are single story with no basement. 2/3 of them are multiple stories with a basement. And there's only 5 or 6% that are elevated. Okay, so guess what structure sees damage the first? What did I tell you about the buildings with basements? So of the housing stock that's there, 65% of it is the worst situation in terms of being impacted by storms, and there's only 5 or 6% of it that's elevated and is out of. By comparing those two, the importance of the presence of the dune providing protection. All right. So all of the maps, by the way, for all of the firms for the flood rate insurance maps and the like, all assume doom and failure. And our empirical evidence suggests exactly the same thing. So that's the scenario that's most likely, which is the dunes eroded case. Okay, so we've also done the case with 7 feet of sea level rise, exactly the same scenario. Here, we've introduced 2 new things that have come in. The color coding is exactly the same, but I would tell you that the white dots are structures that are now below mean sea level. That building, that house, that structure disappeared because it's below mean sea level now. And the other ones, there's some black ones, which you see at the headland there, right, to the western end of the pond. Those got taken out by coastal erosion, and that area doesn't erode very much compared to the barrier itself. So we sort of have a way to sort of understand what the implications of the sea level rise are in terms of taking houses out because they're below mean sea level, and also what the increased risk is at houses that are adjacent to that. This is side-by-side comparison. So 100 is on the left, and 100 plus 7 feet is on the right, with erosions and a dune eroded. One of the questions was, if you look at these for a while, you go a little dot blind. I do. I kept looking, gosh, which one is which? And so, being in charge of the project, I had somebody sort that out for me. I said, make me 2 pictures, one which shows the things that are eroded, give me the black dots there, and then sort out the buildings that are below mean sea level, so they're there. So, by the way, I've kept this at a very high level. This analysis goes right down to the individual structure level, right? So here's an example of our ability to zoom in. And I hope one of you doesn't live in one of those places, but okay. In any case, that's the idea, which is we go, you can see the characteristics down at the individual structure levels by the ID, and then all the detailed characteristics of the structure. So we can sort of take a look at any one of them, and this is a case up for Charlestown. This will make your head hurt. Makes my head hurt. I'm going to leave that for those that are entertained and want to follow up. We'll run this thing for you again. Dunes present, 100 year. Dunes eroded, 100 year. Dunes eroded, 2 feet of sea level rise. Dunes eroded, 7 feet of sea level rise. So this visualization is we just took one section. This is a big deal to sort of handle the mechanics and computing for this, but it gives you a really good sense of what's going on, right? Okay, so I'm going to show you exactly the same thing for Warwick. So there's the house classifications. I'm pleased to see that our number of houses is about the same as Nicole's. Otherwise, one of us was going to have to do some song and dance here. I was hoping it was going to be her and not me, but okay, it could have been me. But I think we're good. So what happened is we can see, the first thing you notice is, did you notice the change in the number of buildings that are in harm's way? We went from order 1,000 in Charlestown that were in the 7 foot plus 100 years. We've gone to 5,000 here, right? So a factor of 5. So big difference in housing density. We also see the housing type. The mix is about the same. So our most prevalent house types are multi-story homes with a basement. And what's happened, of course, is because we're inside the bay, the amount of structures elevated has almost disappeared. So this is the same kind of map that you've seen before. This is waves and water depth. I would point out to you the scale here is again in meters, so the top of this thing is about 20 feet, right, or so. It turns out that the exposure here in Warwick, strangely enough, is about the same exposure that you have in Charlestown. And the reason is that the Charlestown case, the water level is lower, but the waves are higher. And as you go up the bay, the water level is higher and the waves are lower. But in terms of the damage, it looks like about the same level of damage, but there's a dramatic increase here because of all of the structures, right? The housing, if we did this by housing density, it's a housing density story there. Here's exactly the side by side, so no sea level rise on the left, and then sea level rise at 7 feet on the right. All right, so it's a little hard to see that, but you can see this, essentially the Warwick Neck area. That whole area is that little red that little red tip there. So we can see that dramatic change in the damage profile. Okay, so to close up here, some of the benefits they use in this thing is that it's objective, it's quantified, assesses the risk, it uses the most current state-of-the-art models for both inundation, waves, as well as the most recent estimates for damages. These damage curves came from the Corps of Engineers study of post-Sandy of New York and New Jersey. I haven't shown you the case here. We essentially restricted our attention here because most of the structures in harm's way are residences, right? There's an occasional hospital, there's no hospitals in harm's way here, and you have the occasional public utilities building or something like that. So there's commercial buildings, the risk there is high, but the impact is not that large. And the things you worry about are hospitals and emergency things, and there's only one or two, right? So we've not sort of focused on those. But you have a mix of those things, this method can do it. It explicitly considers sea level rise, so you can do other scenarios about what you think might play out for your area. The damages here, if I told you that your house was 65% damage, I bet you could go to your tax assessing records. And my house is $200,000, and at 60%, that's 100, right? That's right. So you can do the numbers yourself. We stayed out of that business, and the reason is that we didn't want to give people an immediate heart attack. A small stroke would have been okay, but a stroke and a heart attack at the same time is a bad idea, right? If you're trying to get somebody engaged in this conversation, which is to try to help them understand their risk, right? But the quantification of this in terms of dollars. We also, you can also guess that if you have this stuff and it's available online, you could go and take a look at your house and say, oh my God, I didn't realize I was at risk, and the damage would be this much. And you could go back and you could say, what happened if? What if I elevated my house? How much would I need to do so to bring my risk down? And so it's inherent in this kind of calculation to be able to do that kind of analysis. It will be web accessible, publicly available. It's GIS based. It's actually sitting on the Storm Tools website right this minute with the access controlled until we feel a little better about the details of this. We've essentially taken this, one of our undergraduate classes, I had them take a look and apply the same method to eastern end of Matunic Beach, and we looked at a couple of remedial operations, which was to protect some of the high-density housing down there, also to take a look at whether indeed at the eastern end of Matunic Beach, it turns out that there was a very nice, wonderful dune system. And that dune system has gotten progressively eroded, and it ends up being the primary attack route for offshore waves to come in to get to the road, the beach road. Okay. We also had the students go back and take a look. It turns out that the backside of the pond, Potter's Pond, gets flooded through the inlet in Potter's Pond, right, from Point Judith Pond. And so I had the students take a look and say, what would happen if we were to temporarily block that tidal inlet? What kind of protection could that provide? So this mechanism here, this methodology allows you to do all of those tests. This, of course, is consistent with the methodologies that Grover talked to you about, and we're convinced will help in some people in their community rating system. Okay, so we've developed and applied this to Charlestown and Warwick as two case examples. The students have done East Matunic. The next undergraduate class is coming in about a week and a half, and we're going to have them march briskly forward on Musquamacut as another place where high risk, high density housing, barrier system, coastal protection. And so we're getting ready for that. The housing density and flood impacted areas is much higher in Warwick, a factor of 5 than it is in Charlestown, but they have comparable exposure, strangely enough. I didn't quite believe that until I started taking a look at the numbers, and sure enough. And the reason is, you know, what happened is all this storm surge business, it's because the wind's pushing the water. So the offshore wind pushes the water. And when it goes close to the coast, the water goes up against the coast and spreads out horizontally, right? So guess what happens when the wind starts pushing the water up Narragansett Bay? Up it goes, right? So it turns out that there's a 40% amplification of the water level from the mouth of the bay to the head of the bay associated with the storm, and almost no amplification as you go along the coast. So you get the surge along the coast that's relatively flat, but because of the shape of the bay, you get this really large amplification. And of course, that explains that why the hurricane barrier is located at the head of the bay. So the good part is it protects downtown Providence. The bad part of it is it had to be really high in order to do so. And the reason is that it's ahead of the bay. So one of the take-home messages for me here was I was shocked at the difference in damage between houses with and without basements. It was sort of startling. And if I owned a house in that area, the first thing I'd be looking at is what kinds of wet proofing I could do to my basement to try to reduce my exposure to this, because it doesn't need to be permanent. It just needs to, the equivalent of putting up the storm protection device when you have a storm coming. And the differences in damages here are really quite startling. I showed you the visualization tool. Most people listen to me give this talk. They look at a couple of maps, they look at the dots, and like my students, their head tips a little to the left and leans a little forward. And then slow breathing. And then I normally do that. Oh, okay. Anyway, the visualizations help communicate this stuff quite effectively and quite quickly. You don't have to sort of pay a lot of close attention to go, oh, that changed from orange to red. I know that's in trouble. So ArcView access to this stuff, just like the earlier presentation, and we are right now doing some extensions to some sea level rises that are at the lower end to fill out some of the framework that's been used in some of the other analyses. So the idea is if you're doing a design and not many people are going to walk forward and say, yeah, I'd like to design for 1,000 years, and I'm going to raise my house at 130 feet because I think in 1,000 years that's how high it'll be. But what you are going to do is, I'm thinking about building a house in this area. The mortgage to that is likely to be 30 years, and I'm likely to want the value of the house probably will maintain its value if everything is wonderful for 50 or 70 years. So I'd like the thing to stick around that long. So the smart money is to build with that design in mind. And so what happened is we want to have the tools that are necessary for people to thoughtfully go through this process and then be able to do that. And with that, I stop.
Thank you, Malcolm. Questions for Malcolm? Yes.